Nothing echoes quite like a gavel hitting a wooden sound block in a hollow, underfunded municipal room. It is a sharp, utterly final crack that splits your life neatly into before and after. You expect a grand, sweeping crescendo when a 5-year marriage dies, some explosive climax worthy of all the tears you wasted in the dark. Instead, you get flickering fluorescent lights humming a flat B note, the aggressive scent of industrial lemon floor wax, and a man who once swore to love you forever, checking his silver Rolex because your grief is making him late for lunch. Cold air blasted from a tarnished brass vent directly onto Nebula's neck. She shivered, pulling the collar of her beige polyester cardigan tighter around her shoulders. It was an ugly sweater, pilling at the elbows, missing a button near the hem. She had bought it at a discount rack 3 years ago because Simon needed a new laptop for his promotion, and they were tightening the belt. Simon Fletcher sat 3 feet to her left, smelling faintly of expensive bergamot and fresh ink. He did not look at her. His posture was a masterclass in calculated indifference, shoulders relaxed, right ankle casually resting on his left knee, exposing a sliver of navy blue silk sock. He looked like a man waiting for a delayed flight in a first-class lounge, not a man dismantling a family. "Sign on the dotted line, Mrs. Fletcher," the opposing counsel said. His voice was a grating nasal drone. He slid a stack of heavy stock paper across the scratched oak table. "Initial here, here, and here, acknowledging that you waive all claims to Mr. Fletcher's current and future assets, his retirement accounts, and the equity in the townhouse." Nebula stared at the blue sticky tabs marking the edges of the pages. The edges were sharp. The paper looked blindingly white under the terrible overhead lighting. "Just sign it, Nebula," Simon muttered. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her in 3 hours. His voice was a low, tired rasp. The kind of voice you use when a child is asking too many questions at the grocery store. "We agreed on this. Let's not drag it out and make a scene." She picked up the cheap plastic ballpoint pen provided by the court. The plastic was slightly sticky. Someone had chewed on the cap. Her own lawyer, a weary public defender type she had hired for a flat fee of $800, leaned in. "You don't have to agree to zero alimony, Nebula. You've been out of the workforce for 5 years. You kept the house. You supported him while he built his firm. A judge would likely grant you something." "She brought nothing to this marriage," Simon interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp, carrying across the empty spectator benches behind them. The judge, a bored-looking woman with half-moon spectacles, didn't even look up from her monitor. "I paid the mortgage. I paid for the groceries. She couldn't even manage a part-time job. I am not subsidizing a grown woman's laziness for the next 10 years. She's useless." Useless. The word didn't sting. It didn't burn. It just sat there in the space between them, heavy and gray, like wet cement. Nebula looked at her hands. Her cuticles were dry, cracked from doing all the dishes without gloves because Simon hated the smell of rubber. Her nails were unpainted, trimmed short. These were the hands of a woman who had spent half a decade scrubbing grout with toothbrushes, clipping coupons, and silently swallowing her pride to play the role of the devoted working-class housewife. She had done it all on purpose. 5 years ago, Nebula had craved a life so painfully ordinary it bordered on boring. She was exhausted by a world where every handshake was a transaction, where love was measured in stock options, and where her last name felt like a neon target painted on her back. She had wanted to know what it felt like to be loved simply because she was Nebula. So she buried her identity. She moved to a mid-sized city, rented a tiny apartment, took a job at a local library, and met Simon. Simon, who was ambitious, but broke. Simon, who kissed her forehead and promised they would build an empire together from scratch. She let him believe he was building it. She let him feel like the king of their tiny, struggling castle. She wore cheap clothes, learned to make casseroles stretch for 3 days, and quietly celebrated his minor corporate victories as if they were historical triumphs. And the moment he got a taste of real money, the moment his boutique consulting firm landed its first $1 million contract, he decided she no longer fit the aesthetic of his new life. She was the starter wife, the scaffolding. Now that the building was erected, the scaffolding was just an eyesore. "Nebula," Simon snapped, tapping his manicured index finger against the table. "I have a 1 o'clock with the regional VP, please." Nebula didn't argue. She didn't cry. The deep, agonizing heartbreak she had experienced when she first found the texts on his phone months ago had entirely calcified. What remained was a hollow, fascinating numbness. She pressed the pen to the paper. The ink skipped at first, scraping a dry groove into the page before the cheap ink flowed. N. Fletcher. She signed her married name for the absolute last time. She initialed the blue tabs. She handed the stack back to the nasal lawyer. The judge stamped a document with a heavy, metallic thud. "Decree entered. You are divorced. Good luck to you both." Simon immediately stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket in one fluid motion. He didn't look back at the table. He simply picked up his leather briefcase and walked down the center aisle, his leather-soled shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum. Nebula remained seated for a moment. She let the silence of the room settle over her. She tasted old coffee and copper in the back of her mouth. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her worn canvas tote bag and pulled out a burner phone she had purchased 2 days ago. She typed a single text message to a number she hadn't dialed in 5 years. "It's done. Come get me." The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of damp wool and misery. It was a cavernous space filled with echoing voices, crying babies, and the muffled arguments of people whose lives were unraveling in real time. Nebula walked toward the revolving glass doors, her cheap loafers squeaking slightly against the polished marble floor. Her legs felt heavy. She was carrying nothing but her canvas tote, yet she felt as though she were dragging a parachute behind her. Near the security checkpoint, leaning against a faux granite pillar, was Simon. He wasn't alone. Standing next to him, laughing softly with a hand resting lightly on his forearm, was Chloe. Chloe was 24, an associate at Simon's firm. She wore a tailored cream pantsuit that probably cost more than Nebula's car. Her hair was a flawless, cascading sheet of blonde, and she smelled of expensive sandalwood. Nebula slowed her pace, not wanting to engage, but Simon caught sight of her out of the corner of his eye. His smile faded instantly, replaced by a mask of performative pity. He whispered something to Chloe, who offered a tight, uncomfortable smile before taking a step back, pretending to check her phone. Simon intercepted Nebula near the metal detectors. "Nebula, hold on a second." Nebula stopped. She didn't look at him. She looked at the knot of his tie. "We don't have anything left to say, Simon." "Look, I know how hard this is for you," he said, using his best, reasonable, executive voice. It was a tone he used to negotiate vendor contracts. I'm not a monster. I know you're walking away with nothing. You don't have a degree. You haven't worked in years. I don't want you living on the streets." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. He held it out toward her. "There's a cashier's check in here for $10,000, Simon said, his voice lowering so the security guards wouldn't hear. "It's out of my personal account. Consider it a severance. Use it to get a decent apartment in a cheaper area. Maybe enroll in some community college classes. Learn a trade. You need to do something with yourself, Nebula. You can't just float through life depending on other people anymore." Nebula stared at the envelope. $10,000. He was offering her $10,000 as a consolation prize for half a decade of servitude, disguised as a grand gesture of philanthropy. A sharp, bitter laugh clawed its way up her throat, but she swallowed it down. It tasted like ash. "Keep it," Nebula said quietly. Her voice lacked any venom. It was entirely flat, entirely exhausted. Simon's jaw tightened. The rejection offended his ego. He forced the envelope forward, tapping it against her canvas bag. "Don't be a martyr, Nebula. It's pathetic. You literally have nothing. No family, no friends, no money. Put your pride away before you starve." Nebula finally raised her eyes to meet his. Simon looked exactly as he had on their wedding day, yet entirely foreign. The man she married had slightly crooked teeth and nervous hands. This man had veneers, a spray tan, and eyes as cold as a bank vault. She searched his face for a flicker of the boy who used to split a single bowl of instant ramen with her on Tuesday nights, laughing about how rich they would be one day. He wasn't there. He had been dead for a long time. "I said keep it, Simon. Buy Chloe a nice purse." Chloe flinched slightly in the background. Simon's face flushed a dull, angry red. He shoved the envelope back into his pocket, his facade of charity cracking entirely. "Fine, drown then," he spat, stepping out of her way. "I'm done trying to save you. You were an anchor around my neck for 5 years, Nebula. I am finally cutting the rope." Nebula didn't reply. She adjusted the strap of her bag, walked past the metal detectors, and pushed her way through the heavy revolving doors into the blinding midday sun. The heat hit her immediately. It was late May, and the concrete plaza outside the county courthouse was radiating warmth. Exhaust fumes from idling buses mixed with the smell of roasting hot dogs from a nearby vendor's cart. The noise of the city crashed over her. Sirens in the distance, horns blaring, the chatter of pedestrians rushing back to their office jobs. She walked down the wide concrete steps, moving away from the entrance, toward the large paved plaza that separated the courthouse from the municipal park. There were a few scattered stone benches. She chose one that was partially shaded by a dying oak tree and sat down. She pulled her knees together, resting her hands in her lap. 10 minutes passed. The courthouse doors opened again, and Simon walked out, his hand resting confidently on the small of Chloe's back. They were smiling again. The unpleasantness of his ex-wife had clearly already evaporated from his mind. He pulled out his phone, likely requesting his black car service to take them to a celebratory lunch. Nebula watched them from a distance. The cynical part of her brain wondered if they would go to the Italian place she had spent months trying to get Simon to try. The one he always said was too pretentious, until his new boss mentioned liking it. She closed her eyes, listening to the traffic. Then she heard it. It started not as a sound, but as a vibration, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to rattle the loose gravel on the pavement. The pigeon scavenging near the hot dog stand suddenly took flight in a chaotic flurry of gray wings. The thumping grew louder, shifting from a vibration into a heavy, mechanical roar. Pedestrians stopped on the sidewalks. People emerging from the subway turned their faces upward, shielding their eyes from the sun. A shadow fell over the plaza, then another. 3 massive Sikorsky S-76 helicopters, painted entirely in matte black, broke through the skyline, flying in a tight V formation. They were flying terrifyingly low, kicking up a massive vortex of wind that sent stray newspapers, food wrappers, and dust swirling violently across the concrete. The noise was deafening. It was a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. Simon, standing near the curb, grabbed Chloe's arm as a sudden gust of wind threatened to blow them off balance. He looked up, his brow furrowed in annoyance and confusion. Municipal helicopters occasionally flew over the city, but never in a fleet, and never this low. The lead helicopter didn't pass over. It banked sharply, the rotors shrieking as it descended toward the open expanse of the municipal park, directly adjacent to the courthouse plaza. "They can't land there!" someone yelled over the roar of the engines. "That's a public park." The lead chopper ignored the imaginary rules of city zoning. Its landing skids touched down heavily on the manicured grass, the downdraft completely flattening a bed of municipal tulips. The other 2 helicopters broke formation, hovering defensively a few hundred feet above, keeping the airspace locked down. Before the rotors of the landed chopper even began to slow, the chaos on the ground multiplied. From the north end of the street, ignoring a red light and a frantically whistling traffic cop, a fleet of 5 armored vehicles arrived. 4 jet black Range Rovers flanked a massive, custom-built Rolls-Royce Phantom. The vehicles moved with predatory synchronization, their tires screeching as they jumped the curb, drove directly onto the pedestrian plaza, and slammed on their brakes in a semicircle near the landed helicopter. People were screaming now, backing away rapidly, pulling out their phones to record. Simon pushed Chloe behind him, his face pale. He was an arrogant man, but he was not stupid. You did not see this level of coordinated, militaristic luxury unless someone very important or very dangerous was arriving. The doors of the Range Rovers snapped open simultaneously. A dozen men poured out. They were massive, clad in identical bespoke dark suits with discreet earpieces, their eyes hidden behind polarized sunglasses. They moved instantly, forming a human perimeter that pushed the gawking crowds back. "Clear the area! Move back, please!" one of the men barked, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. Simon backed up onto the courthouse steps, pulling Chloe with him, completely captivated by the spectacle. The side door of the helicopter slid open. A man stepped out into the swirling wind. He was in his late 60s, but he moved with the brutal, contained energy of a much younger man. His hair was silver, swept back severely from a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a 3-piece suit in a charcoal wool that defied the summer heat, holding a silver-handled walking stick that he used more as a prop of intimidation than for support. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the architectural grandeur of the courthouse. His piercing, icy blue eyes swept the plaza until they locked onto a single, solitary figure sitting on a stone bench under a dying oak tree. Nebula stood up. The wind from the rotors whipped her cheap polyester cardigan around her body. She reached up, slowly pulling the hair tie from her head, letting her dark hair fall loose around her shoulders. The silver-haired man walked directly toward her. The wall of suited security guards parted for him seamlessly. As he walked past Simon, who was standing barely 10 feet away, Simon's breath hitched. Simon knew faces. It was his job to know the faces of the global elite. "My God," Simon whispered, his grip on Chloe's arm tightening painfully. "That's Alistair Morgan, the CEO of Vanguard Holdings. What is a billionaire doing in family court?" Alistair Morgan did not notice Simon Fletcher. Alistair Morgan did not care about Simon Fletcher. Alistair stopped 3 feet away from the woman in the faded beige sweater. The entire plaza seemed to hold its breath. The roar of the helicopter engines spooled down to a low whine, making the sudden silence feel heavy and dramatic. Alistair looked at Nebula. His eyes raked over her worn shoes, her unpainted nails, the dark circles under her eyes. A muscle feathered in his jaw, tight with a mixture of immense sorrow and terrifying rage. "You look terrible," Alistair said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and carried no need to shout. It simply demanded to be heard. Nebula offered a small, broken smile. "Hello, Father." The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd was entirely drowned out by the sound of Simon Fletcher dropping his leather briefcase. It hit the concrete with a loud, pathetic slap. Simon's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes darted frantically from the titan of global industry to the woman he had just berated in a hallway for being useless. "Father?" Alistair reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping Nebula's cheek. The imposing, terrifying billionaire softened for a fraction of a second, entirely ignoring the hundreds of camera phones trained on them. "5 years, Nebula," Alistair said softly, his thumb brushing a stray tear that had finally managed to escape her eye. 5 years of playing house with a peasant who didn't know your worth. Are you quite finished with this rebellion? Nebula swallowed hard. The numbness was cracking, splintering apart under the weight of her old reality crashing back down upon her. She looked past her father's shoulder, meeting Simon's terrified, rapidly paling face. She looked at the man who had promised her the world, only to lock her in a cage of his own mediocrity. She looked at Chloe, who was staring at Nebula with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Nebula looked back to her father and nodded. "I'm finished, Dad," she whispered. Alistair's eyes turned cold again. He dropped his hand and turned slightly, finally acknowledging the existence of the man standing frozen on the steps. Alistair Morgan's gaze hit Simon Fletcher like a physical blow. It was a look of complete, unadulterated extermination. "Get her bags," Alistair commanded, not looking away from Simon. 2 massive men in suits immediately stepped forward. One gently took the cheap canvas tote from Nebula's limp fingers. The other respectfully offered her his arm, treating her not like a displaced housewife, but like royalty returning from exile. Nebula didn't look at Simon as she walked toward the waiting Rolls-Royce. The heavy armored door was opened for her. The leather interior smelled of cedar and power. It smelled like home. As she slid into the back seat, Alistair paused before following her. He stood in the center of the plaza, leaning on his silver-handled cane, letting the silence stretch out until it became unbearable. He finally spoke, projecting his voice just enough to reach the man paralyzed on the courthouse steps. "Mr. Fletcher," Alistair's voice boomed, chilling despite the summer heat. "My daughter left my home with nothing because she wanted to build a life. You have broken her heart. In return, I am going to break your entire world. By the time the sun sets today, your firm will not exist. Your bank accounts will be frozen. Your reputation will be a smear on the pavement. Enjoy your lunch." Alistair stepped into the vehicle. The door slammed shut with a heavy, vault-like thud. The convoy of Range Rovers violently spun their tires, reversing off the plaza, clearing the airspace. The helicopter's rotors spooled up instantly, the deafening roar returning, drowning out the frantic questions Chloe was screaming at a completely catatonic Simon. Nebula sat in the back of the silent, soundproofed cabin. She reached down, took the cheap polyester cardigan off her shoulders, and dropped it onto the floorboard. Silence inside the Phantom was absolute. Acoustic glass blocked the city's frantic pulse, leaving only the faint hum of the V12 engine and the sharp hiss of climate control. Nebula stared at the toes of her scuffed loafers, resting on thick, midnight blue lamb's wool floor mats. Her hands trembled. Adrenaline was finally leaving her system, replaced by the sudden, violent decompression of a lie she had lived for 5 years. Alistair sat across from her in the rear-facing seat, a heavy crystal tumbler of sparkling water resting on his knee. Offering empty platitudes wasn't his style. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, waiting for the shock to metabolize. Sunlight baked the concrete plaza back at the courthouse, but Simon felt freezing. Nausea clawed up his throat, tasting like the metallic tang of old pennies and stress sweat. Panic is rarely loud at first. It usually starts as a high-pitched ringing in the ears. Chloe tugged at his sleeve, her voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. "Simon? Simon? What just happened? Who was that?" Blinking rapidly, Simon tried to focus on her face. Her flawless makeup suddenly looked garish in the harsh, midday light. Pulling his phone from his breast pocket, his thumb left a greasy smear of nervous sweat on the glass screen. He opened his primary banking app. Access denied. Error code 403. His chest tightened. A glitch. It was just a server issue. Swiping to his firm's secure messaging app, he waited for the interface to load. The screen refreshed, pulling down 3 urgent messages from his managing partner, David, before the app violently force-closed. Tapping the icon again brought up an automated prompt requesting his login credentials. The password he had used since 2019 came back as invalid. "Call David," Simon rasped, his voice cracking. Gripping Chloe's shoulder, he pulled her closer, perhaps a bit too hard. "Call David right now." Chloe recoiled, massaging her arm. "You're scaring me, Simon. Why is your app not working?" Digging into her designer purse, she pulled out her phone and dialed. It went straight to voicemail. "Try again." 3 attempts yielded the same automated greeting. Simon's breathing grew shallow. Turning back, he looked at the courthouse steps. The place where he had stood 10 minutes ago, feeling like a titan negotiating a petty settlement, now felt like an executioner's block. Alistair Morgan didn't make idle threats. The machinery of his destruction was already moving, silent and invisible, pulling the pins out of Simon's carefully constructed life, one by one. "My car," Simon muttered, his eyes darting toward the curb where his reserved black car usually waited. The spot was empty. "Where's the driver?" "I don't know, Simon." Chloe's voice rose an octave, edging into hysteria. People walking past were still pointing at them, whispering. The spectacle of the helicopters had painted a massive target on their backs. "I'll call an Uber. Let's just get back to the office." 10 minutes later, sitting in the back of a smelling sedan that reeked of cheap vanilla air freshener, Simon finally got a text to go through. It was from his assistant, Greg. "Don't come up. Security is at your desk. They have boxes." Simon stared at the pixelated text until the letters blurred. 5 years of kissing up to senior partners, stealing client rosters, and working 80-hour weeks. Gone in the span of a 20-minute car ride. He looked out the window at the passing city blocks. The man who had walked into family court this morning was dead. He just hadn't attended the funeral yet. Vanguard Tower pierced the skyline, 72 stories of black glass and steel that devoured the afternoon sun. Pulling into the subterranean private garage felt like entering a high-security bunker. Security personnel in charcoal suits stood at attention near a private elevator bank, their eyes scanning the armored convoy as it parked. Nebula stepped out of the car. Cool underground air smelled of polished concrete and expensive tire rubber. A young man with a discreet earpiece stepped forward, offering a slight bow. "Welcome back, Ms. Morgan." Barely nodding, Nebula caught her reflection in the polished steel doors of the elevator. Beside her father's immaculate tailoring, she looked like a vagrant. The faded jeans, the stretched-out collar of her cotton shirt, the hollowed-out cheeks. This was the costume she had chosen. This was the armor she wore to prove she wasn't just a trust fund check, only to realize the man she wore it for despised it anyway. Rising to the penthouses took exactly 40 seconds. The elevator opened directly into Alistair's private office. It was a cavernous room smelling of old paper, leather, and espresso. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of the city, a sprawling grid of concrete and ambition that her father practically owned. Alistair walked behind his massive mahogany desk, dropping his cane into a stand with a sharp clack. Pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, he didn't ask if she wanted one. "Sit, Nebula," Alistair commanded, pointing to a Chesterfield sofa. Sinking into the tufted leather, Nebula pulled her knees to her chest. It was a childish gesture, but she felt entirely unmoored. "You shouldn't have made a scene, Dad." "A scene?" Alistair scoffed, taking a slow sip. The ice clinked sharply against the glass. "That wasn't a scene. That was pest control. You disappeared for 5 years. 5 years, Nebula. I respected your asinine need to find yourself among the pedestrian class. But I drew the line at letting that mid-level grifter humiliate you in public. He didn't know who I was." "That makes his behavior worse, not better," Alistair snapped, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "He treated you like garbage because he thought you had no leverage. People who only respect power are dangerous, Nebula. They are also exceedingly easy to break." A heavy silence settled between them. Nebula stared at the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. The numbness was finally wearing off, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. The betrayal still hurt. 5 years of inside jokes, burnt dinners, holding his hand when he was anxious about a presentation. All of it erased because she didn't match the aesthetics of his new tax bracket. "What are you doing to him?" Nebula asked quietly, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. Alistair set his glass down. The heavy thud anchored the room. Vanguard Holdings just initiated a hostile acquisition of his consulting firm's parent company, Alistair stated, his tone flat, entirely devoid of emotion. It was just business. By 3 o'clock, his managing partners will be informed that keeping Simon Fletcher on staff is a liability that will tank the buyout. His personal assets are currently being audited by a forensic team I retain, who will undoubtedly find the corners he cut to buy his new suits. His bank accounts are frozen pending a fraud investigation. Nebula's breath hitched. Fraud? Everyone commits a little fraud when they start making real money, Alistair said dismissively. My team just knows exactly where to look for it. And that little harlot he was with? Her employment contract has a morality clause. My legal team is forwarding the divorce transcripts to human resources as we speak. Closing her eyes, Nebula felt the room spin slightly. The sheer velocity of the retribution was dizzying. I don't want to be this person, Dad. I don't want to crush people just because we can. We aren't crushing him because we can, Alistair said, walking around the desk and sitting heavily next to her on the sofa. He smelled of expensive cologne and faint cigar smoke. We are crushing him because he threw my daughter away like a broken toy. Welcome back to the real world, Nebula. It's brutal out here. Nebula leaned her head back against the leather, staring at the ceiling. The cheap polyester cardigan was gone, but the ghost of it still clung to her shoulders. She had wanted a simple life. She had wanted to be loved for making terrible casseroles and remembering to buy his favorite coffee. Instead, she had bought a front-row ticket to her own obsolescence. He offered me $10,000, Nebula whispered, the memory suddenly rising like bile. In the hallway, he handed me a check and told me not to starve. Alistair stopped moving. The glass in his hand remained perfectly still. When he turned his head to look at her, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The icy blue of his eyes hardened into something feral. $10,000, Alistair repeated softly. It wasn't a question. It was a death sentence. Severance, Nebula added, a bitter, cynical smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. He called it severance. Standing up, Alistair walked back to his desk. He picked up his desk phone, pressing a single button. The line connected instantly. Call off the acquisition, Alistair told the voice on the other end. I don't want to buy the firm anymore. I want you to bury it. Bleed their clients, poach their senior staff, and tie up their capital in litigation until they file for Chapter 11. I want Simon Fletcher blacklisted from every corporate entity on this continent. He doesn't get to start over. Alistair hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. He looked back at his daughter, his expression entirely calm. Get up, Nebula, Alistair said, gesturing toward a set of double doors at the far end of the office. My tailor is waiting in the residence. We have a charity gala to attend tomorrow night, and you are going to look exactly like the predator you were born to be. Panic does not arrive in a grand, sweeping wave. It is a slow, methodical rot. Simon stood on the blistering pavement outside his corporate plaza, staring at the revolving glass doors that had been his gateway to the upper class for 3 years. His bespoke suit, tailored perfectly to his shoulders, suddenly felt heavy and suffocating. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his spine, pasting his Egyptian cotton shirt to his lower back. Security guards flanked the chrome turnstiles inside the lobby. These were men Simon usually ignored, faces he swiped past with a distracted nod while checking quarterly projections on his phone. Now, 2 of them were standing squarely in front of the entry gates. Beside them, resting on a polished marble counter, was a brown cardboard banker's box. Simon, Chloe's voice was thin, vibrating with a pitch that made the small hairs on his arms stand up. What are we doing? Let's just go inside. Let's talk to David. Ignoring her, Simon pushed through the heavy doors. The air conditioning hit his damp skin like a physical blow. He walked briskly toward the turnstile, reaching into his pocket for his security badge. His hands were shaking so violently, he nearly dropped the plastic card. Slapping the badge against the RFID reader, he waited for the familiar green light and the soft, mechanical click. Beep, beep, beep. Red LED lights flashed angrily across the small screen. Access denied. "Mr. Fletcher," the older security guard said. His name tag read Gary. Simon had never noticed it before. Gary did not step aside. He pushed the brown cardboard box across the slick marble. "I have instructions to give you this and ask you to vacate the premises." Looking down at the box, Simon felt his stomach plummet. A framed photo of himself accepting a junior partner award lay on top of a disorganized pile of legal pads, personalized pens, and a spare silk tie. Someone had dumped his desk drawer directly into the carton. They hadn't even bothered to stack the notebooks. "Gary, there is a misunderstanding," Simon stammered, offering a smile that felt like wet clay sliding off his face. "I am a senior partner here. Let me up. I need to speak with David." "David left the building 20 minutes ago, Mr. Fletcher," Gary replied, his voice devoid of sympathy. "He left strict orders. If you attempt to bypass this desk, I am to call the police and have you trespassed. Please take your belongings." Chloe gasped. Simon whipped his head around to look at her. She was staring at her own phone, her face completely drained of color. Her thumbs hovered over the screen, trembling. My email is locked," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "Simon, I can't get into the company portal. They locked my email." Grabbing his box, Simon felt the rough cardboard scrape against his manicured cuticles. The weight of it was pathetic. 5 years of late nights, missed dinners, and calculated networking, reduced to 15 pounds of office supplies. He turned back to the glass doors, stumbling slightly as his leather sole slipped on the polished floor. Getting back to his townhouse took an hour on the subway. His black car service had canceled his account due to a declined credit card. Sitting on the molded plastic seat of the D train, Simon stared at the scuffed floorboards, the cardboard box resting awkwardly on his lap. Chloe had refused to come with him. She had hailed a cab, crying hysterically about her reputation, leaving him standing on the curb without a backward glance. Entering his neighborhood, the familiar rows of gentrified brownstones offered zero comfort. The digital lock on his front door flashed green when he punched in the code, a tiny mercy in a day of catastrophic failures. Dropping the box onto the kitchen island, Simon pulled out his laptop. He needed to understand the scope of the damage. He needed to find a loophole. Booting up his personal email, he found his inbox flooded, not with client inquiries or congratulatory messages about his divorce. It was a deluge of automated alerts. Notice of account freeze, pending investigation, margin call alert, brokerage account deficit, immediate action required, mortgage auto pay failed. Clicking frantically, Simon opened an email from a prominent legal recruiter he had been quietly courting for months. The subject line was simply, "Withdrawal of representation." "Simon, due to recent developments regarding your standing at the firm and impending litigation involving Vanguard Holdings, we can no longer represent you as a candidate. Please do not contact this office. Vanguard Holdings." Staring at the glowing screen, Simon finally allowed the reality of the morning to penetrate his thick, arrogant skull. The helicopters, the bespoke suits, the silver-haired man who looked at him like a cockroach. Nebula, his quiet, passive Nebula. The woman who wore discount sweaters and bought store-brand pasta sauce because she said they needed to be frugal. The woman who sat silently in the corner at his corporate dinners, looking utterly ordinary. She was a Morgan. Bile rose violently in Simon's throat. He rushed to the stainless steel sink, gripping the edges until his knuckles turned white, dry heaving violently. The metallic taste of ruin coated his tongue. He had spent 5 years calling her useless, mocking her lack of ambition, tearing down her confidence to build himself up. He thought he had outgrown a peasant. Instead, he had divorced the apex predator, and he had done it by spitting in her face. Dragging himself away from the sink, Simon slid down the front of the custom oak cabinetry, pulling his knees to his chest. The silence of the empty townhouse was deafening. The $10,000 cashier's check was still sitting in his breast pocket, a radioactive reminder of the exact moment he had signed his own death warrant. Silk feels entirely different from polyester. It doesn't scratch or cling. It pours. It moves over the skin like cold water, heavy and deliberate. Standing on a small velvet pedestal in the center of the Vanguard penthouse residence, Nebula stared into a floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror. Madame Rousseau, a tailor her father had flown in from Paris years ago on a permanent retainer, circled her like a silent, calculating hawk. A pincushion was strapped to the woman's wrist. Cold steel pins slid into the fabric near Nebula's waist, cinching the emerald green silk tighter against her ribs. "Breathe in, mademoiselle," Madame Rousseau murmured around a mouthful of extra pins. Doing as she was told, Nebula felt the rigid boning of the bodice press firmly against her torso. It was a suffocating kind of support. The dress was a masterpiece of architectural tailoring, designed to look effortless while requiring total submission from the person wearing it. It left her shoulders bare, cascading down into a severe, elegant column that pooled at her feet. Alistair sat in a wingback leather chair near the window, a tablet resting on his lap. He hadn't looked at the screen in 10 minutes. He was watching the transformation, his face an impenetrable mask of quiet approval. Looking at her reflection, Nebula felt a profound, unsettling disconnect. The woman in the mirror was striking. Her dark hair, freshly washed and treated, gleamed under the harsh vanity lights. Her skin, previously pale and exhausted, had been prepped with expensive serums that smelled of crushed pearls and lavender. Yet, beneath the silk, Nebula could still feel the phantom itch of the ugly beige cardigan. "It fits perfectly," Alistair stated, his voice rumbling softly in the vast room. "You look like your mother." Flinching slightly, Nebula accidentally caught a pin against her side. A tiny droplet of dark crimson swelled on her pale skin. Madame Rousseau immediately dabbed it away with a cotton swab, muttering an apology in rapid French. "My mother hated these galas," Nebula said, her voice flat. She didn't break eye contact with her own reflection. She used to say wearing this much money felt like wearing a target. "Your mother was a brilliant woman who understood the necessity of armor," Alistair replied, closing the cover of his tablet. "This is not a dress, Nebula. It is a declaration. Tomorrow night, half the board of directors will be looking for weakness. They know you disappeared. They know you ran away to play house with a nobody. They need to see that the Morgan heir has returned and that she is entirely unbothered." Closing her eyes, Nebula took a shallow breath against the tight corset. She remembered the smell of the library where she used to work, the dusty scent of old paperbacks, and the quiet hum of the radiator. She remembered the Tuesday nights with Simon, before the money, when they would sit on a second-hand sofa and watch terrible reality television. It had all been a performance. Simon's love had been entirely conditional on his own convenience, and her entire life had been a desperate attempt to pretend she wasn't carrying the weight of a billion-dollar empire. "He offered me $10,000, Nebula whispered, the memory echoing loudly in the quiet room. Alistair leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know. I spent 5 years washing his socks. I gave up my 20s to make him feel like a man. And when he decided he was done with me, he priced my entire existence at $10,000. A bitter, jagged laugh escaped her lips. It sounded harsh, entirely devoid of humor. "I used to tip the pool boy in the Hamptons more than that. People who lack inherent value always try to put a price tag on everyone else," Alistair said quietly. He stood up, walking over to the pedestal. He dismissed the tailor with a subtle flick of his wrist. Madame Rousseau gathered her sewing kit and vanished into the hallway, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. Stopping beside the mirror, Alistair looked at his daughter's reflection, not her actual face. "You are grieving a ghost, Nebula," Alistair said, his voice softer now, lacking the corporate edge. "You are mourning a man who never existed. Simon Fletcher was a parasite who found a willing host. You let him feed on you because you thought it made you normal. You are not normal." Reaching out, Nebula traced the line of her own jaw in the mirror. The cheekbones were sharp. The eyes were dark, tired, but finally clear. The naive girl who had signed away her alimony in a linoleum-floored courthouse was gone. "Is it done?" Nebula asked, dropping her hand. "The acquisition of his parent company was officially terminated an hour ago," Alistair confirmed, checking his heavy gold watch. "By noon tomorrow, his firm will be in receivership. His bank accounts are frozen. The lease on his townhouse contains a morality clause tied to his firm's equity, which is now worthless. He will be evicted by Friday." Turning slowly on the pedestal, Nebula faced her father. The silk rustled around her legs, a heavy, expensive sound. "What about the girl?" Nebula asked. "Chloe?" Alistair raised an eyebrow. "She tendered her resignation this afternoon to avoid being fired for cause. She blocked his number and is currently staying in a hotel near the airport, trying to secure a flight out of the city before her own reputation is tied to his sinking ship." A hollow sensation settled in Nebula's chest. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't joy. It was just the cold, sterile reality of absolute power. Simon had tried to destroy her with 1,000 tiny paper cuts, chipping away at her self-worth for half a decade. Her father had destroyed Simon's entire universe before dinner. Stepping off the pedestal, Nebula let the long train of the emerald gown drag across the Persian rug. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering grid of the city below. Somewhere down there, in a dark townhouse, Simon was realizing exactly what he had thrown away. "Tomorrow night," Nebula said, her breath fogging the cool glass slightly. "Who is at this gala?" "Everyone who matters," Alistair replied, walking up to stand beside her. "Investors, rivals, politicians, everyone who needs to know that my daughter is back." Pressing her hand flat against the glass, Nebula felt the chill of the evening sky seeping through the pane. She thought about the cheap plastic ballpoint pen she had used to sign the divorce papers, She thought about the blue sticky tabs. "Make sure Simon gets an invitation," Nebula said, quietly. Alistair turned his head, a genuine smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. It was a terrifying expression. "Are you sure? He will likely be completely unhinged by tomorrow evening." "I'm sure," Nebula answered, her voice dropping the last remnants of the timid housewife she had pretended to be. "I want him to stand at the back of the room. I want him to watch me wearing this dress. I want him to see exactly what he couldn't afford." Heavy cream-colored cardstock carries a distinct physical weight. Simon Fletcher sat in the center of his dismantled living room, rotating the envelope between his thumb and forefinger. The electricity in his townhouse had not been shut off yet, but the suffocating silence made the space feel like a crypt. Dust motes drifted lazily through the slanted afternoon sunlight, settling on the stack of cardboard banker's boxes near the front door. Inside the envelope was a single piece of thick, matte black stationery. The lettering was pressed in gold foil. It smelled faintly of expensive binding glue and ozone. "The Morgan Foundation requests the honor of your presence. Friday, May 29th. The Grand Atrium, Belvedere Hotel." Simon stared at his own name, handwritten in flawless looping calligraphy across the top. A terrifying, delusional spark ignited in the back of his mind. Narcissism is a resilient parasite. It feeds on the smallest scraps of ambiguity. Why would she invite him? His firm was gone. David, his former managing partner, had sent a 3-paragraph email that morning, officially dissolving their LLC to avoid the Vanguard acquisition trap. His bank accounts remained frozen, flashing glaring red error codes whenever he tried to log in. Chloe had blocked his number. He had spent the last 48 hours drinking warm tap water and pacing the hardwood floors, waiting for the final blow. But here was an invitation. Simon stood up, his knees popping in the quiet room. He walked into the master bathroom and stared at his reflection. Dark, bruised bags hung under his bloodshot eyes. A 2-day shadow of coarse stubble coated his jaw, but beneath the exhaustion, that arrogant spark flared into a small, desperate flame. Nebula was soft. She had always been soft. For 5 years, she had apologized when he raised his voice. She had shrunk herself to fit perfectly into the negative space of his ego. "She wants me there," Simon reasoned, splashing cold water onto his face. The water dripped down his chin, soaking into the collar of his wrinkled shirt. "She's putting on a show for her father, but she can't let me go. She wants me to see her dressed up. She wants me to beg." If he could just get her alone for 5 minutes, away from Alistair Morgan's suffocating orbit, he could fix this. He could use that pathetic, desperate love she had always harbored for him. He could grovel, apologize, play the victim of his own ambition. He could manipulate her just like he always did, pulling his only remaining clean suit from the cedar closet, a charcoal wool blend he had worn to court just days prior. Simon began to dress. His hand shook as he threaded his silk tie. The fabric smelled faintly of stale sweat and the cheap vanilla air freshener from his last taxi ride, a sharp contrast to the bespoke bergamot cologne he aggressively sprayed on his wrists. He was going to get his life back. Oppressive late-spring humidity suffocated the city as Friday evening descended. The Belvedere Hotel sat like a glowing limestone fortress against the dark skyline. A fleet of black luxury vehicles lined the curved driveway, their engines idling in a low, rhythmic purr. Simon stepped out of a damp yellow taxi half a block away. He didn't have enough cash to tip the driver. Walking toward the grand entrance, his leather-soled shoes felt heavy on the damp pavement. A perimeter of men wearing discreet earpieces and tailored tuxedos guarded the velvet ropes. Simon approached the podium, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Name," the man at the podium asked, not looking up from his illuminated tablet. "Simon Fletcher." The man swiped a finger across the screen. He paused. Slowly, he raised his head, his eyes sweeping over Simon's slightly wrinkled suit, the desperate sweat gleaming on his forehead, the frantic energy radiating from his posture. The security detail knew exactly who he was. Alistair Morgan left nothing to chance. "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Fletcher," the man said smoothly, unhooking the heavy velvet rope. It wasn't a welcome. It was the opening of a trap door. Inside the grand atrium was a masterclass in aggressive predatory wealth. Towering arrangements of white orchids and black calla lilies spilled over the edges of marble columns. The air was thick with the scent of roasted figs, chilled vodka, and expensive ambergris perfumes. A string quartet played in the corner, but the music was entirely drowned out by the low, calculated murmur of 100 billionaires negotiating the future of the global market over champagne. Simon stood near a towering ice sculpture, gripping a crystal glass of bourbon so tightly his knuckles turned white. He felt entirely exposed, like a man walking into a firing squad, entirely naked. People brushed past him without apologizing. Waiters offered him trays of caviar with dead, empty eyes. Then, the murmuring shifted. It wasn't a sudden silence, but a subtle change in the atmospheric pressure of the room. Heads turned toward the grand, sweeping staircase at the rear of the atrium. Simon turned. The bourbon sloshed over the rim of his glass, burning his thumb. Nebula was descending the stairs. She wore the emerald silk gown. It poured over her frame like liquid glass, completely altering the architecture of her body. Her shoulders were bare, dusted with a subtle, shimmering powder that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. Resting against her collarbone was a diamond necklace that likely cost more than the GDP of a small island nation. Her dark hair was swept back into a severe, elegant knot. Alistair Morgan walked one step behind her, a silent, terrifying shadow carrying a silver-handled cane. Simon forgot how to breathe. The cognitive dissonance physically hurt his brain. He superimposed the memory of the woman in the faded beige cardigan over this breathtaking, untouchable aristocrat, and the two images violently rejected each other. This woman had never scrubbed his grout. This woman had never clipped a coupon. This woman belonged to a world that Simon could never buy his way into, no matter how many junior partners he stepped on. As Nebula reached the floor, a flock of executives and socialites immediately swarmed her, offering deference disguised as small talk. She smiled, a sharp, practiced thing that didn't reach her eyes, and nodded politely. Simon watched her for 20 minutes. He watched the way she held her champagne flute. He watched the way powerful men leaned in when she spoke, desperate to catch her words. The delusion that had carried him through his front door began to rot, replaced by a cold, crawling terror. He needed to talk to her before he lost his nerve entirely. Downing the rest of his bourbon in one searing gulp, Simon placed the empty crystal glass on a passing waiter's tray and began pushing his way through the crowd. Nebula felt the vibration of Simon's anxiety before she actually saw him. Standing near the balcony doors, the cool night air provided a brief reprieve from the suffocating heat of 100 competing colognes. The emerald silk corset was tight, forcing her spine into perfect alignment. She was exhausted, but it was a clean, sharp exhaustion. The kind you feel after waking up from a long, terrible fever. Nebula. The voice was rough, scraping against the elegant hum of the room. She turned slowly. Simon stood 3 feet away. His charcoal suit, the one he had worn with such arrogant pride in the courtroom, looked incredibly cheap under the warm golden lighting of the Belvedere. Sweat beaded at his temples. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and utterly panicked. A sharp, instinctive muscle memory twitched in Nebula's chest. For 5 years, her default setting when Simon looked upset was to immediately shrink, to apologize, to ask how she could fix his day. She felt the ghost of the beige cardigan resting heavily on her shoulders. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the rigid boning of the corset hold her upright. The ghost evaporated. 2 of Alistair's security detail materialized from the crowd instantly, stepping between Nebula and Simon. Their hands hovered casually near their suit jackets. "It's fine," Nebula said quietly, raising a single finger to wave the guards back. They stepped aside, though their eyes remained locked on Simon's throat. "You came," Nebula observed, her voice entirely flat. She did not offer a smile. She did not look angry. She looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying insect. "You ruined me," Simon hissed, taking a half-step forward. He kept his voice low, terrified of the men in the dark suits, but his desperation bled through every syllable. "My firm is gone. My accounts are locked. I have an eviction notice on my door, Nebula. You completely destroyed my life in 2 days." "I signed a piece of paper, Simon," Nebula replied, her tone perfectly even. "You destroyed your own life the moment you forgot I was a human being." Simon shook his head rapidly, a nervous, involuntary tic forming at the corner of his eye. "This is insane. You're insane. You lied to me for 5 years. You pretended to be a nobody. You let me pay for everything. You let me stress about the mortgage." "I let you build the life you swore you wanted," Nebula interrupted softly. The quiet authority in her voice made Simon's jaw snap shut. "I gave you a blank slate. You wanted a traditional wife, so I played the part. I cooked your meals. I listened to your complaints about David. I celebrated every minor victory you dragged home. I loved you, Simon. I loved the man I thought was building a foundation for us." She took a deliberate step closer to him. The scent of her expensive lavender serum completely overpowered the cheap vanilla clinging to his lapels. "But you didn't want a partner," Nebula continued, her dark eyes entirely devoid of warmth. "You wanted a stepping stone. You wanted a witness to your own greatness. And the second you got a taste of real money, you looked at me and saw a peasant who didn't fit your new aesthetic. You threw me away in a municipal hallway and offered me $10,000 to disappear." Simon swallowed hard. The metallic taste of total ruin flooded his mouth. He looked around frantically, hoping to see a familiar face, a sympathetic observer. There was no one. The elite crowd had subtly shifted away from them, giving the Morgan heir a wide berth to conduct her execution. "Nebula, please," Simon's voice finally broke, shattering into a pathetic, wet rasp. The arrogance was gone. The delusion was dead. "I was wrong. I was stupid, and I let the money get to my head. Just Call off your father's dogs. Let me keep my townhouse. I have nothing left. Please, you owe me that for 5 years of lying." Nebula stared at the man she had once promised to love until she died. She searched her chest for a flicker of sympathy, for a drop of the agonizing heartbreak she had felt the day she found Chloe's texts on his phone. There was nothing. Just cold, empty air. "I don't owe you a single breath," Nebula whispered. She turned her head slightly, catching the eye of the lead security guard. She gave a microscopic nod. "Wait," Simon gasped, reaching a hand out toward the shimmering green silk of her dress. He never made contact. A heavy, leather-gloved hand clamped onto Simon's shoulder with bone-crushing force. The guard didn't say a word. He simply pivoted Simon backward, pulling him off balance, and began marching him toward the heavy oak doors at the rear of the atrium. Simon stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished marble. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his absolute powerlessness finally crushed whatever fight he had left. He looked back over his shoulder, his face pale and slack, as the heavy doors swung open, revealing the damp black night outside. He was pushed out into the oppressive humidity. The doors clicked shut behind him, sealing the vault. Nebula stood perfectly still, listening to the string quartet transition into a bright, sweeping Vivaldi piece. "Are you all right?" Alistair appeared beside her, holding 2 crystal flutes of champagne. He didn't look toward the doors. He didn't care about the garbage once it had been taken out. Nebula looked down at her hands. The cuticles were still slightly dry. The nails were still trimmed short. She was still Nebula. The dress, the diamonds, the terrifying power of her last name. They were just different variations of the armor she had to wear in a world obsessed with transactions. She reached out and took the crystal flute from her father. The glass was ice cold against her warm palm. "I'm fine, Dad," Nebula said, turning to face the glittering, crowded room. She took a slow sip of the champagne. It tasted like ash and victory. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Did you love the sweet taste of instant karma? Let us know in the comments how you would have handled Simon's betrayal. If you want to see exactly how Alistair dismantles Simon's entire life in the next chapters, you have to stick around. Hit that like button to support Nebula's return to power. Share this story with someone who loves a good revenge plot, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single update in this billionaire drama.